Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back and welcome to our very first hybrid event. So I'm welcoming people in the room, and I'm also welcoming, of course, our audience online. And before I begin, I would like to thank our tech team, which is Jesse, and of course, Naira Tumanian for getting us set up today and doing this really new kind of way of presenting our work in this forum. For those of you who are participating online, you can submit your questions basically on the Q&A section. And Naira and I will both monitor the questions and then pass them on to our speaker. So, leading up to the semester, we have been filled with cautious optimism. And of course, the recent rise in positive cases gives us a little bit of pause as we are carefully, slowly, and distanced coming back together in this incredible learning community. Students are brimming with excitement and their smiles, although masks are visible in their eyes. I had a very wonderful encounter with a student in my office today who was just so thrilled to be back on campus and engaged with me in person, and it was super exciting. We are learning how to communicate, I guess, differently, and we have to move with patience as things continue to change. But the conversations with students and colleagues have been inspiring as we are eager to create a new normal. But what is clear is that this generation of students who have maneuvered a year and a half of a global health crisis and witnessed as well as participated in the fight against racism and systematic injustice will walk the world quite differently. The difficulties generated for all, I hope, will translate into a more empathetic community. This generation too will have to radically tackle the world's problems as the global community we are facing an undeniable climate crisis that undoubtedly is caused by human activity. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change states that every corner of the planet is already being affected and it could get far worse. Climate scientists have been warning and researching the effects of global warming for decades. But scholars across the humanities and social science, of course, have a role to play. Indeed, historians, sociologists, and political scientists, among many, have begun to pay particular attention to the relationship between living organisms, including humans, and their physical environment, or in short, ecologies. So acknowledging and moving with great urgency this upcoming academic year, the Center for Armenian Studies invites you to join us in examining Armenians through their relationship with their physical environments, past and present. We will introduce the theme of Armenian ecologies by insisting on a dialectical relationship of humans and nature, as they are real and as they are imagined. Scholars from wide-ranging fields, including history, geography, and literary studies, will foreground these Armenian ecologies by introducing what we might call an interdisciplinary anthropogenic scholarship, which, to cite Dipesh Chakrabarty, spells the collapse of the age-old humanist distinction between natural history and human history. The Anthropocene, or the age of human, as a scholarly frame, demands no less than an integration of climatic and ecological changes with the cultural, social, and political change historians already study. Moreover, this focus will allow us to map the interconnection between ideas, emotions, genres, and other non-material entities. From the environmental impact of the wars in Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh, changes in land use, the memories of landscapes, to mapping and studying Armenians in multi-ethnic physical spaces, to viewing the genocide through deep maps, not masks, but maps, we will view Armenians' history and contemporary experience as intricate ecologies of being. In the most recent weeks, we have witnessed how fires, floods, and famine haunt our societies. And today's open lecture, Let Them Taste Hunger, Famine, Inequality, and Communal Belonging in the late Ottoman Empire, couldn't be more fitting to inaugurate the center's theme. Our speaker this evening is this year's Manoogian Postdoctoral Fellow in Armenian History, Matthew Ghazarian. And Dr. Ghazarian received his PhD from Columbia University's Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies in 2020. And after spending the pandemic teaching a course on reforms and revolutions across the empires for the University of California, Berkeley, I think he did that remotely. Dr. Ghazarian is now joining Michigan's History Department as well as the Center for Armenian Studies, and will be teaching a course on famine in the global context. The lecture today is based on Dr. Ghazarian's dissertation titled Ghost Rations, Empire, Ecology, and the Community in the Ottoman East from 1839 to 94. And the dissertation is a beautifully composed work that brings together environmental history and the history of capitalism to explain the growing communal conflict that tore apart the multi-ethnic and multi-confessional Ottoman Empire. Beginning with the Tanzimat of 1839 that included a sultanic decree of religious equality, Dr. Ghazarian takes his reader across half a century, ending with 1894, when confessional equality was nothing but a distant dream. With massacres against Armenian Christian minorities sweeping across Eastern Anatolia, the main question that guides his inquiry: why did a crucial mass of people come to see the world as divided into discrete communities locked in tension? Surely a question that has occupied historians of the empire for some time. Ghost rations, however, uniquely contributes to a more recent historiographical trend that examines the discursive construction of difference and belonging in the empire by insisting that, in Dr. Ghazarian's own words, we must account for provincial partners and the material condition that assisted in hardening communal boundaries. Exposing changing economies and ecologies in the Ottoman East, Dr. Ghazarian's work generally is interested in new property regimes, wage disparities, and transportation channels, all of which transformed how people could eke out a living from the land. But it is moments of crisis that drive his argument, famine in particular. Examining sources produced by Ottoman officials, Armenian clergymen, American missionaries, and British officials, Ghost Ration argues most powerfully that, I quote, access to necessities made some ideas about difference and belonging appear more plausible than others. Indeed, when some communities receive grain and others go hungry, the divisions sown are not easily overcome. Today's talk zeroes in on a devastating famine that struck the Ottoman East in the immediate aftermath of the 1877-78 Russo-Ottoman War, and the sectarian solidarities that the lack of food and widespread starvation generated. A historical discussion that no doubt will be instructive in this present moment. And with this, I will turn over the floor to Matthew, and welcome to Michigan. It's a pleasure to have you.
Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Wonderful. First, I'd like to thank Melanie Tanilian, Naya Tumanian, the Center for Armenian Studies, the History Department, and everyone here at Michigan who has helped to make this possible. And thank you. So, as you all have just heard, my name is Matthew Ghazarian. I'm a historian of conflict and coexistence in the modern Middle East and the late Ottoman Empire. And my broader book project looks at how social categories like ethnicity and sect are constructed through economic and environmental forces. So today I'm going to talk about one portion of that broader project, how examining famine and inequality can help us understand the rise of mass violence defined by ethnic and sectarian boundaries. And I'll be looking at this between Armenians, Kurds, Turks, and others in the late 1800s. So these are the ruins of a village called Konk in the mountain district of what is now Eastern Turkey. It's a district called Sassoon. And in the fall of 1894, the Ottoman governor of this district of Sassoon reported to the Ottoman Sultan's palace that there was a rebellion taking place there led by Armenian villagers. And the palace responded with orders to crush the bandits and leave a legacy of extraordinary terror. The resulting massacres marked the beginning of a wave of anti-Armenian and anti-Christian violence that spread across the empire. The violence lasted for about 4 years, from 1894 to 1897. The bloodshed came to be known as the Hamidian massacres after the Sultan of that period, Abdulhamid II. This is one of the many gruesome caricatures of Abdulhamid II that featured on the front pages of European magazines at this time. Now, most of the bloodshed took place in the Ottoman East. That is, the mountainous borderland region between the Ottoman Empire, Iran, and the Russian Empire. This is also the headlands of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where their tributaries wind through mountains and hills as they have for millennia. And among those hills and winding tributaries of the Tigris and Euphrates, if you were there 150 years ago, for example, you'd find many Armenians, Kurds, Turks, and others, a mix of Christians and Muslims. Now, the outbreak of the Hamidian massacres disproportionately affected Armenians and those who dared to defend them, but the overall carnage was substantial. Many tens of thousands dead, many more wounded, homeless, hopeless. This is a photograph of a mass grave that was published by an Armenian and his American travel companion in the region of Erzurum, just after violence struck that area. Now, the Hamidian massacres marked a major shift in the history of the Ottoman East. They demonstrated how, in the Ottoman Empire, as in other parts of the globe, ethnic and sectarian boundaries were becoming primary rallying points of popular mobilization. Why did ethnic and sectarian categories become so powerful for mobilization during this period? To answer that question, first I'll show how a transformation was taking place in the Ottoman East, how ethnic and sectarian lines were becoming the primary lines of collective violence. Then I'll offer my argument for why this was the case. So others have tried to explain this violence by pointing to great power politics. By contrast, my work focuses on cultivators and shepherds in agrarian provinces, rural areas like the Ottoman East, areas like Sassoon. Ordinary people, came to live ethnic and sectarian divisions through unequal experiences of hunger, material hardship, financial collapse, and a whole host of other difficulties that might not touch the boardrooms and the negotiating tables of great power diplomats. So let's move on. Here, first I'll talk about political ecology. That is how different environmental forces affected different communities of the Ottoman East in different ways. And in so doing, it sparked conflict among them. Then I'll look at economic forces and show how they also had an impact, an unequal impact, on the different communities of the Ottoman East. And I'll do this by discussing the sovereign debt crisis that the Ottoman Empire faced during this period. And then finally, I'll look at how uneven access to humanitarian aid also intensified divisions along ethnic and sectarian lines. So, a brief overview. Let's talk about mass violence in the Ottoman East. Now, what exactly do I mean by the Ottoman East? So here's the Ottoman Empire. This is its extent under Suleiman the Magnificent. And here is the region that I'm discussing more or less when I'm discussing the Ottoman East. Now, environmentally, this is a strategic region because it contains the sources of two of the most important rivers in the Middle East, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Politically, it's also really important because it forms the borderlands between Kazarian, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. It's in fact been a borderland for millennia. It continues to be a borderland. And it wasn't only a political borderland, but also a cultural borderland. It was rich with many languages, ethnicities, and different faiths. The predominant groups, as I mentioned before, were Armenians and Assyrians, who were mostly Christian, and Kurds and Turks, who were mostly varying types of Muslim. And to give you a sense of that diversity, let's zoom in just a little bit. So this is a map of the languages spoken in these regions. And again, here's the Ottoman East, and it looks a bit confusing. And that's because it's accurate. It was confusing. There were many different languages spoken in these regions and many groups who shared them. Now, if we looked at this map after 1923, after the founding of the Turkish Republic, it would look very different and a lot simpler. And the beginning of that change, we can locate it sometime in the 1800s, when the populations of this region started to, in the words of one British official at the time, unmix. By 1923, decades of war and violence that had occurred both before the First World War, during the First World War, and after the First World War, ended with a crude partition of these lands by sect. Christians, like Armenians and Greeks and Assyrians, were either expelled or dead, and many hundreds of thousands of Muslims were expelled or killed and poured in from the Balkans, from Russia, and from other neighboring areas. So that unmixing, like I said, gained momentum in the late 1800s. Now, one major turning point was that event I just described, the Hamidian massacres in the 1890s. One novelty of that violence that sources at the time highlighted was how the massacres had a popular aspect, that there was a critical mass of ordinary people who were joining in this violence. Now, in addition to textual sources for my research, I also used some video archives that were available through the University of Southern California. This is Levan Guerrilla. He was born in Kayseri in 1885, and this is a screenshot from his interview that was recorded in 1984 in California. Now, Mr. Guerrilla was about 10 years old when the Hamidian massacres engulfed his hometown. And when asked about the perpetrators of this violence, he described how there was a mass or popular aspect to what was going on. In his words, the perpetrators were ordinary Turks, ordinary people. That is, when local leaders who were involved in the violence encouraged mob violence, there was a critical mass of people ready to join. Now, if we look back on the history of the Ottoman East, we can find that groups didn't always rise up based on sect or ethnicity. It wasn't a sure thing that if someone made a call to rally because you were a Muslim or a Christian, that anyone would listen. For instance, in 1847, just a few decades before, there was an upstart local autonomous ruler named Bedirhan Bey who refused orders from Istanbul. He wanted to coin his own coins and run his own autonomous state. So the Ottoman Sultan sent in his armies to set things straight, and a civil war broke out in the region. Yet that bout of collective violence, and be sure, a bout of collective violence did begin, that bout did not get defined by ethnic and sectarian boundaries. Rather, Christians and Muslims formed multi-sectarian coalitions. Some Christians allied with Bedirhan Bey, and some Christians allied with the Ottoman Sultan. So for example, here we have a petition from that period, and it was signed by rebels of the eastern city of Van. And the petition asks the Sultan to give up on this invasion, to allow everything to return as normal, to rescind his orders, to send in his forces and impose new taxes. And most of this document, as you can see, is taken up not by its contents, but by the seals of its signatories. And if we zoom in, the optics alone can tell us a lot. So I'm just bringing up those seals there. And you see the one above, that says Ali in the Turco-Arabic script. It's a very common Muslim name. Below it, we have Krikor. That's an Armenian script. Now, I studied the 49 seals that are present here on this document, and 14 of them, or just over a quarter, were Armenian. So documents like these show that rebels could include Christians and Muslims, that collective violence was not always divided by sectarian or ethnic boundaries. It could be divided by political boundaries, it could be divided by class boundaries. There's just a number of ways that it could have shaken out. Now, yet, a generation later, in 1894, the lines are very clear, and they are defined by sect and ethnicity. So, here we are. What happened in this crucial set of decades? Why did the dynamics of the Ottoman East change so much? Today, I'm going to focus on a key turning point around the year 1878. Armenian, Turkish, Kurdish, and other historians, groups that don't usually get along or see eye to eye on the way history is written, actually see eye to eye on this issue. They all share a rare consensus that 1878 is a crucial turning point in the history of this region. Now, 1878 is considered a major turning point because of a war between the Ottomans and the Russians, as well as the great power politics that ensued just after the war. The war that I'm describing is the 1877-78 Russo-Ottoman War. It brought devastating losses to the Ottoman Empire, who had to cede valuable territories in the east, in the Russian Caucasus, as well as in the west, in the Balkans. And after the war, state dignitaries met in Berlin in 1878 to negotiate a settlement. So on the left here is a painting of those dignitaries negotiating the settlement. You can see the Ottomans on the right in their red fezzes, negotiating with the white-haired European dignitaries with all their medals and badges. Other historians have focused on the violence of the war and its humiliating results that took place at this negotiating table in order to explain the rising ethnic and sectarian tensions of this period. They point out how, after the war, Ottoman officials and intellectuals started emphasizing the Islamic character of the empire, fashioning themselves as leaders of the Muslim faith. Likewise, European leaders did the same. They fashioned themselves more so as leaders of the Christian world or Christian empires. But even if powerful elites had ideas about how people should mobilize and be organized, it didn't mean people would listen. And to understand why this was a turning point in communal relations, I argue that we need to account for transformations happening for ordinary people in small towns and in agrarian regions. The majority of Ottoman subjects lived in such areas, and very few of them could read a map or a treaty, let alone take in the effects of one. And even if they could, they were much more focused on daily struggles like putting bread on the table. And what's more, while state dignitaries were in Berlin in all their regalia negotiating the end of this war, a drought and a famine were ravaging the Ottoman East. Images like this one were on the front of European journals, this one being from the city of Bonn, once again. And estimates from the time suggested that the famine in this region, the Ottoman East, killed just as many people as the war had in that region, about 10,000. So if, as others have suggested, we should consider the war's violence as a reason for intensifying ethnic and sectarian boundaries, surely we should also consider the famine's violence as well in having a hand in these rising communal tensions. So moving on from mass violence, let's look a little bit at famine and inequality and the unequal effects of this famine. So I'm going to talk a little about the causes as well as the unequal effects of this famine. And after doing that, it'll become clearer how ecological and economic forces worked together in inscribing ethnic and sectarian lines as the primary lines of social organization in this region. And then after doing that, I'll move on to the debt issue and the politics of the aid. But for now, let's stick with the famine. So just after the war, there were many reports of strange weather and drought in the Ottoman East. Rains weren't raining, snows weren't snowing, until they finally did rain and snow, and by that point it was too much, and there were floods and other problems that people faced. Now, here is some correspondence among Ottoman bureaucrats at the time for organizing rain prayers in the Hagia Sophia, which was then a mosque in Istanbul. And it talks about how both in the Hagia Sophia, as well as in schools and mosques across the empire, people should gather together to pray for rain. Now, one aspect of 19th century life that we tend to overlook today is the amount that people relied on animals. Sheep and cattle provided crucial labor power. They provided products like milk and wool. They even provided heating in the winter. And the problem is that during a drought, when crops don't grow, neither does forage and grass for animals. So here's a letter written by an American missionary in the region. His name is Henry Barnum, and he's describing how famine was killing off the region's livestock. Oops. So he writes that to purchase the necessary hay is so expensive that many whose supply is exhausted are constrained to kill many of the sheep and cattle, sheep and goats, after keeping them all winter. And the lingering winter, preventing the grasses from growing, were making people desperate. So these desperate people, hungry people, could not afford to buy the hay they needed to feed their livestock, so they would slaughter them. And that's where we get here. Now, those losses affected a lot of people, because most people needed animals, but they disproportionately affected certain groups, and that would be those groups that held most of their wealth in animals. And in this case, in the Ottoman East, that was tribal Kurds. So here's another American missionary writing, and he's discussing how one tribe had 18,000 sheep last autumn and are now reduced to 200. So these nomadic tribes, who are mostly Kurdish, were suffering a bit more from the drought in terms of animal mortality. because animal mortality was robbing them of their most valuable resource. Now, it wasn't just Kurds that seemed to be sparking these comments about uneven suffering. So there was also an ethnic division of labor in this region that seemed to be causing some other sorts of uneven suffering. And we see this across the archival record. So here we have a discussion of aid that was all being distributed to Kurdish villages, which seemed to be suffering far greater than Armenian ones. Or again, the Turks and Kurds are suffering the most. Or again, the Turkish villages were in a worse condition than those inhabited by Christians. So we should be a little careful here with the terminology Turks and Kurds. Now, they don't mean the same thing that they mean today. And in fact, their meanings were very, we'll say, evolving and ambiguous. The word Turks and Kurds could mean people who speak Turkish or Kurdish. They could mean certain kinds of Muslims, whether they're Shafi or Sunni. They could indicate whether someone was a settled farmer or a nomad. In all those situations, at least that I've seen, whenever someone says Turk or Kurd, they mean not Christian. So a division of labor with Kurds holding animals and Armenians or others farming more may go so far to explain uneven suffering that these observations say that something else was going on here, because it wasn't just Kurds, it was Turks and Kurds or a broader Muslim population that seemed to be suffering more. So why were these observers noticing that Armenians seemed to be weathering the famine better than their Muslim neighbors? And to understand that, I would argue that we need to look not just at the ecological conditions, but also at the economic conditions that the empire was facing, and that was dominated by the Ottoman sovereign debt crisis. So to connect a sovereign debt crisis to a famine in the Ottoman East, we can draw on the work of the economist Amartya Sam, who studied how famine arises less from absolute shortage than from poverty. He writes, starvation is the characteristic of some people not having enough food to eat. It's not the characteristic of there not being enough food to eat. It's a strange play of words, but the meaning is important. It's not that there isn't enough food, it's that some people don't have it. And the reasons behind the troubles of the Ottoman East come clear when we bear this in mind. Namely, in the Ottoman East, it wasn't that there wasn't food available. It's that most people didn't have it, or specifically, didn't have any money to buy it. This will become clear when we look at the sovereign debt crisis. So I'm going to give a very rapid fire timeline here. In 1875, the Ottoman government declared a moratorium on its debt payments. It simply couldn't afford even the interest on its mounting foreign debt. Then in 1876, there were uprisings in the Balkans. These were heating up, and in 1877, Russia intervened on behalf of a number of Balkan nations, and this sparked the war. And it wasn't until 1881 that the Ottomans were able to cut a deal with their creditors and solve the default issue. So what happened in the middle? Well, this famine broke out. And now, during the war, the Ottomans were out of money. So they printed paper money like this. But paper money isn't all that useful if it's not backed by anything and your government's in default. And sure enough, this is a graph of the value of that paper money versus the gold currency, or I should say, it's the amount of paper money you needed to buy gold currency. And you see how that number slowly, or rather quickly, climbed up and up throughout, and then throughout the beginnings, and then into the very end of the war. Now, this currency devaluation was obviously not a good thing for anybody, but it was especially bad in the Ottoman East, and here's why. So as I said before, we have the default and the uprisings, and the war begins, and then the famine. Well, a crucial aspect of that agreement that the Ottomans cut with their creditors is that they agreed to back their currency in gold after that. Foreign creditors don't want worthless Ottoman paper paid back to them. They want something in gold. Now, as a result, the Ottoman government decided to turn around and make the same demand of their own people for taxes. So if you want to pay Ottoman taxes, we're not accepting the paper anymore. Instead, you need to pay us in gold. In addition, the Ottoman government also said no more, or at least discounted rates for non-gold metals like silver and copper. This is devastating for the working classes. Most people didn't even have enough money to buy a single gold lira. So with the stroke of a pen, many people's wealth disappeared. And sure enough, these monetary decisions turned up in violent ways in the Ottoman East, where drought had already reduced harvests. So in one example, a man went to the headquarters of the governing building in his district and committed his suicide in a graphic way, slicing his belly open with a knife. A British council's decision to relay this story to Istanbul emphasizes the utter despair that swept through the region thanks to financial decisions that were being brought about in part because of pressure on Istanbul from Paris and London. Now, reports like this one underscore how the Ottoman East experienced a famine that arose both from ecological and economic factors. In fact, I'd argue that it was more of a money famine than a grain famine that struck the Ottoman East. I found evidence in many areas that despite the poor harvest, many granaries were stocked, but most people's money had become worthless, so they couldn't buy them. So the Ottoman sovereign debt crisis, one of the first sovereign debt crises in history, brought these currency devaluations that devastated the empire, and especially the Ottoman East. The droughts had weakened people's ability to feed themselves, and financial decisions had decimated their wealth. On top of that, it should be said, the Ottoman East was a front in the war, which meant that the army was paying for its requisitions or its buying of supplies and things with the paper money that was being printed to finance the war. And that meant that a lot of that paper money ended up near the front, including the Caucasus front in the Ottoman East. So there was a disproportionate amount of that worthless money being held by the working classes there. So there was a lot going on here economically, in addition to ecologically, that was really devastating people. Now that we've got this economic background, we can talk a little bit more about the famine, because we can see that there was a shortage of money at least as much, if not more, than a shortage of grain. So why did Armenians seem to be weathering the famine better than their Kurdish and Turkish neighbors? So this is where we need to talk about famine aid. Now, there were no railways in the Ottoman East at this time. So this is a map of the railways in 1914, decades later. The thick black lines are the railways, and just to show you, there are no thick black lines in the Ottoman East. On the other side of things, the alternative to rail didn't look very good, both because caravans of pack animals are slow when people are hungry, and also because there was a shortage of pack animals in the Ottoman East at this time, as we discussed before, massive animal mortality. So there wasn't a lot of grain being moved around physically. But what the Ottomans lacked in rail infrastructure, they could make up for in telegraph infrastructure. This is a map years before the war of the Ottoman telegraph network. And as you can see, there's quite a sophisticated network spread throughout the Ottoman East. Now, telegraphs move a lot faster than camel caravans or even trains. And given that this was more of a money famine than a grain famine, the most effective way to help people was sending foreign currency and then buying grain locally. And that's precisely what relief agencies tried to do. The Ottoman state's own Famine Commission tried to do this, for example. So here we have, on the left, a picture of an invitation to a charity ball. And you'll notice the invitation, if you can see that far, it's written in French. And that's because it was a ball hosted by the Ottoman ambassador in Belgium. So they were raising foreign currency abroad to help the famine-stricken. And then what were they doing with it? On the right here, we have the draft of a telegram order transferring letters of gold-backed currency to different cities in the Ottoman East, cities like Diyarbakir, Bitlis, Van. And so the Ottoman government raised substantial amounts of money, both within and outside the empire, to help the famine-stricken. And then they would transfer letters of credit using their telegraph network so that people could buy the grain locally. British and American charities also participated, and they also raised hundreds of thousands of piastres. But the Armenian Patriarchate in Istanbul, the religious organization of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, ran its own Famine Commission. And that Famine Commission raised not hundreds of thousands, but millions of Ottoman piastres, 3.84 million, according to the Commission's report. So here's the trilingual seal of that Famine Commission. It's written in Ottoman Turkish, French, and of course Armenian. And here is a sample of the donation lists in that Famine Commission's reports. And this particular page includes donations gathered in Russia, in Romania, in Iran, India, and if I had more room and put more pages, you'd find cities in the US, in Europe, Rangoon, Java, anywhere you could find a member of the massive global merchant diaspora of Armenians, you can find the name of that city in this list. So if we take into account the comparative success of the Armenian Famine Commission, raising not hundreds of thousands, but millions of piastres, then we get a better idea about what was going on in these earlier observations that Armenians seemed to weather the famine better than their Turkish and Kurdish neighbors. The ecological effects of famine were less pronounced for Armenians than, say, tribal Kurds that lived in the region, and the economic effects were mitigated by successful Armenian aid efforts. There was more aid earmarked for Armenians, and outside of the Lake Van regions, Armenians were a clear minority of the population there, between 20 and 30%, if we take at their word some conservative official estimates. And so that uneven suffering arising from the famine, it doesn't go unnoticed. For example, this is an issue of a newspaper called Tercüman-ı Hakikat. It's edited by a famous Ottoman literary figure named Ahmet Mirat Efendi. And we find in this issue a letter published from Kurdish tribal leaders in Van. The letter describes a meeting that was going on there to describe aid and its distribution. And the accusation in it was that, according to these writers, people were saying, let's not give aid to Kurds. They're wild and savage. Let them taste hunger. Now, the publishing of this kind of letter in a prominent Ottoman newspaper shows how famine was providing an opportunity to highlight uneven suffering at the very least. The letter also included accusations towards Armenians, saying that they were entertaining foreigners and they had unsavory ties with foreigners. So it also became a moment to draw lines in the sand between the people who are relating to foreigners and the people who are not. The famine also inspired language of civilizational difference among Armenians. This is a telegraph that had been sent by Manoogian. He's a popular communal leader, a former Armenian patriarch, and in 1880, he was the president of the Van branch of the Armenian Famine Commission. And in this copy of the telegram that he sent to Istanbul, he said that it was more the violence of Kurdish tribes than that of famine that was terrorizing the Armenians of the region. He wrote, "The famine has not frightened the population as much as the pillaging and criminal acts committed by the Kurds, according to the customs of their race." Now, you don't have to look very hard in the Ottoman archives to find examples of acts of violence committed by Kurdish tribes and others taking advantage of the disadvantaged status of Armenians in the region. The archive is full of them. But we see here how there's a leap in the discourse. This isn't language talking about specific tribes or specific perpetrators. This is the language of civilization, or here, race. And in both Tarjuman and Hakikat, the letter before, as well as this letter, I think that we can see examples of how hardship on the ground in the Ottoman East was filtering back up into the way people were discussing difference and belonging in the Ottoman Empire. These are the sorts of messages that likely resonated with audiences who were suffering from financial collapse, who were suffering from military defeat, who were suffering from famine. And not only were they suffering from it, but they were being told or witnessing themselves in some cases that the suffering was unequal. People were living the ethnic and sectarian difference that leaders may have been calling on at this period or later. So let's wrap things up. I asked earlier what went on between the 1840s and 1894. And in this presentation, I made a few arguments about this. So I honed in on the turning point of 1878. And I argued that in addition to looking at the violence of war and the decisions of powerful elites, we need to also look at the everyday sorts of slow and silent violence that were ravaging the Ottoman East during this period. Violence of hunger, of famine, of financial collapse. And I showed how these causes were both ecological and economic at once, and they affected different communities differently. Now, I don't think that it's a coincidence that immediately following this famine, we see increasingly rigid and violent boundaries between Christians and Muslims in the Ottoman East. Armenians organizing themselves into self-defense groups, Muslims joining, we'll say, less intolerant sects or following less tolerant ideas about the role of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Instead, I think that after 1878, when officials and intellectuals and faith leaders were calling on people more and more to mobilize based on sect or ethnicity, it had a certain resonance this time, unlike the 1840s. And it had that resonance because people had unequal experiences of material hardship. So this talk is just a slice of my broader dissertation, or now book project, which looks at conflict and coexistence in the Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East. It's called Ghost Russians. And in it, I look at how the transformations during this modern period were changing the way that people perceive themselves and perceive themselves vis-a-vis other communities. So the first half looks at institutional change and changing forms of religious leadership in the Ottoman East and other provincial areas. And in the second half, I hone in on different cases of famine in the modern period as the Ottoman Empire becomes increasingly enmeshed in new forms of trade and production, what we could call the development of modern global capitalism. And ultimately, both this presentation and this narrow slice, but the project as a whole argues that the divisions that tore these regions apart were not only ideological, they were also material. And when the prevailing perception is that one group receives grain and the other goes hungry, these divisions are powerful and they last and they resonate in ways that might not be so if not for a material resonance going with a discursive call. Thank you.
So much, Matthew. So we'll take questions. And if you, because you are in the spotlight, so if you want to moderate your own questions, that would be good.
Happy to.
Super, and I'll keep an eye on the
Thank
online
you.
one.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
How does what you presented to us justify or explain the massacres of Armenians? Were the same, inequalities or whatever driven the Ottomans to attack Armenians? I mean, for all those of us who do not know details of Armenian history, we do know about the violence against Armenians.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know that there's anything that could justify what happened in the 1890s, but I do think it helps explain in that it's in this period that I presented on today where you see a real change from the leadership, but also from below. And that's the thing I'm trying to get at, is that with the Haminian violence that comes later, a major difference with that and other bouts of collective violence that I've seen are that it's not only coming from a few bad actors within the administration or local notables or whoever could gain from unleashing violence on a particular community, but that there also seemed to be a genuine popular aspect. So there was a critical mass of people who also saw eye to eye with those people. So what I would say is, what I presented here today is a snapshot of a broader set of economic and ecological changes that were making life not only miserable, but also seemed to be divided by class and confession together. They were kind of getting overlaid. And that meant for a much broader, longer lasting, and frankly more virulent strike against Armenians in the 1890s than instead of some isolated incident that might be traced back to a local quarrel. Does that make sense? So I'm not trying to say if X happened because of Y so much as X was the scale that it was because of broader changes taking place.
So is it essentially a religious conflict?
I would argue it's not. I would say that it is religion fueled by, a discourse of religion fueled by real life changes on the ground. Whether you have sheep or not, doesn't matter. You can be a Muslim or Christian and keep sheep. By happenstance, there were more Kurdish nomadic tribes in that region, so the effects of one change affected one community more than the other. I would argue that people instrumentalize religion, and as they do today, and they have in the past. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I'm trying to figure out why it may have this time. Yes?
Hi, I'm Xiaoyue Li. I'm still also in Michigan.
Great.
History. I have two questions specifically. The first question is regarding the monetary system that in the 1880s, around the 1880s, when the Ottoman Empire went bankrupt. So at that time, the global system, monetary system is a very gold standard system. And I suppose Ottoman should also be, which means that Ottoman currency is fixed to the gold. So how the Ottoman Empire was able to depreciate its currency domestically while fixing its currency to the gold. So that seems to be contradictory. because if you want to depreciate the currency, it cannot be fixed growth. Otherwise, there is an imbalance between domestic and international, right? So how the Ottoman Empire were able to do so. And also, for the debt system, it is state treasury that responsible for the debt, not the ordinary people. So when you're arguing that the debt has impact on ordinary people, but the debt does not impose on ordinary people, it imposes on the state treasury. So there is a mediation of state treasury. So if you do not consider the function of the Ottoman treasury and the distribution impact of that institution, it seems to be questionable that you're saying that the debt impact on people. So I hope that is kind of clarified.
Sure. Yeah.
And for the second question,
Can you just
sure.
one second? Matthew, if you can just summarize some of the questions, because I don't know exactly whether or not our online audience hears the questions well. That would be
Sure.
great. Sorry.
Okay.
Thanks.
So the first one on monetary system and debt. You had a second question.
My second question is more related to the description of your talk rather than when you have just talked within 1 hour. So you have raised a question of solidarity or sectarian solidarity, at least in part of your description. And I wonder if you can elaborate the meaning of solidarity, because you didn't mention it in this talk. So I think it's part of your larger arguments. And can you elaborate what solidarity means and how you are able to put solidarity in in parallel with sectarian, because it seems to me that the two words are contradictory in semiotics, at least for me.
Just to make sure I heard. So there's one question on questions of the Ottoman entry into the gold standard, as well as on the effect of debt on ordinary people, of state debt on ordinary people. And then a second question asking about distinctions between solidarity and sectarianism. And sectarianism.
So how do you use that word? How do you carve out the semiotics of these two words and put them together? Although it seems that these two words have contradictory meaning.
Sure. So on the Ottoman monetary system and the gold standard, my understanding is the Ottomans aren't on the gold standard officially until this period, until they negotiate with their creditors in 1881. The US had been, the US, Germany, I believe, and somewhere else, I believe US and Germany, or perhaps US and France, have been fighting over this. I don't want to go into the weeds on it, but there were competing silver and gold standards going on then, and it wasn't until as far as I know, after the Treaty of Berlin, and after that, the Decree of Muharrem in the Ottoman Empire, that the gold standard becomes fixed in the Ottoman Empire. I do believe that, as you say, the state debt was denominated in gold-backed currencies, and previously the Ottomans had been paying that off not with as much gold or money from their own reserves or from taxes from the people, but with more and more debt. They were able to take out more debt and then pay off the interest in their payments, and then they kept doing this until they went into default. Now, the link between the state debt, the Ottoman treasury's obligations, and the people, but at least what I saw in the sources I looked at was that you're right. It shouldn't be the burden of, I don't know, a farmer in Erzurum if the Ottoman Sultan and his ministers couldn't manage to balance the budget. But what was going on during this period is demands for taxes. There are a lot of reports that I found in the archives of tax collectors hounding peasants for taxes, and specifically either rejecting their non-gold currency or really drastically discounting it. So either refusing, they would usually refuse the paper money altogether and then take their silver or copper, but at serious discounts. So the mechanism that links the state debt to everyday people are the tax collectors. And then in terms of solidarity and sectarianism, I see them as two sides of the same coin. Increasing solidarity sort of within a highly variegated group creates a more defined boundary, in that the internal boundaries become less important, and therefore boundaries deemed external become more important. So in this case, maybe for example, solidarity as Muslims, as opposed to solidarity as people from Bitlis or as a village. There are competing solidarities there. And sectarianism is one sort of aspect of that, in that if there's a lot of solidarity along religious boundaries, then those boundaries become hard between each other. If that makes sense. I guess what I'm saying is, I see them as two sides of the same coin. But I'd love to discuss this more with you.
So are you suggesting that if the Armenian world community had not collected the funds and sent through the Patriarchate the amounts that it did for a distribution to Armenian communities, that the massacre would have been avoided? Perhaps more people would have starved, but it would have the attitudes of the groups toward each other before the massacre was dramatically shifted, because there was suddenly a benefit that appeared available only to one ethnic group.
I would suggest no such thing. I don't think so. No. To be honest, in the archival record, you see that there are many examples of Armenians helping their neighbors, Muslims helping their neighbors. There's a lot of solidarity. Disaster can spark all sorts of solidarity and divisions. So what I would say is, what's more important is not what actually happened, who actually got aid, because frankly, we can't know. We can get ideas, and we can look at what data is available from the archival record, but in terms of getting exact numbers of Armenians only got this and didn't get that, that historians could debate for a very long time unearthing sources, and there would still be reasonable room for debate. What I would say is really important, though, is based on that idea that we can get from the sources that are available, there was plenty of fodder for people who wanted to stir up tension, and that there were probably localities where there were inequalities. So I'm not trying to say that the success of the Armenians was somehow a problem. In fact, I think overall, more lives were saved, Christian and Muslim, just because capital was flowing into the region. If I had another hour to give another talk, I could talk about the next set of famines where a suspicious Ottoman administration prevented any foreign money coming in, and everyone was more miserable for it. Though I'd love to find a source of some Kurdish tribal leader, I don't know, waxing poetic about the Armenian aid that came before. So if anyone does find that, let me know. But I'm not saying that at all. No, what I'm saying is the perception of inequality coming from real inequality can fuel division, calls for division that resonate. So that in the 1840s, when the Ottoman Sultan says, "Rally around me, all you faithful," people say, "Forget you. I'm going to join what side makes sense for me in my locality." But then in the 1890s, when there are calls for the faithful to take action, for some reason, people seem ready to rise and act on those divisions. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, but I can't quite understand why you wouldn't agree that if the Armenian contributions had not come in such large amounts and been focused so concretely by the Patriarchate just to Armenian villages, that the usual patterns of behavior from past decades among this variegated population of a variety of ethnicities would have been more difficult to disrupt. The extra money essentially fuel the disruption.
It's an interesting speculation, but it's tough to say. I mean, the Ottoman government was distributing aid, and there were accusations by Armenians that more
Only
aid went
small
there.
amounts of aid, you said. This is much bigger.
It was. You know, it's difficult to say, but I think that the importance here is, again, less on what people thought was going on, because that's all we have access to, and more that they thought it was going on. Yes.
So I want to go to some of the questions that our online audience is asking.
Sure.
I think you, to a certain extent, answered the question that Ron Soni has posed for us. But there is also a question from Vaskin Davidian. Hi, Vaskin. And he says, thank you for your talk, Matthew. How would you explain that Armenian official sources position that Kurds, Turks, and others also received assistance? This was published in the official report as well as in the final report summarized in the newspaper Areveld in 1886 in Constantinople.
Mhm.
Also, the kind of language Communal used to describe the Kurds as barbarian was in use from the early 1800s. See earlier edition of Pasma Web, etc. It wasn't only used by Armenians, but Ottoman officials too. That is one question.
Sure.
Thanks, Vaskin.
Thank you, Oscar. I would totally agree that the Armenian sources are very unequivocal, that they said that they distributed aid to Armenians and where possible, Kurds, Turks, and others. I think it's absolutely true. And in the archival record, it also bears out that you have examples, some of which I showed before, that, you know, Turkish and Kurdish villages surviving because of the mutual aid of their Armenian neighbors. So I wouldn't say that it is a unequivocally unequal situation. I would say that the optics of aid coming from the Patriarchate in such vast amounts, as well as from American missionaries and British officials channeling British aid, gave this impression, at least to some Ottoman writers, that there was a major inequality here. And I would say it's not only to the writers, I wouldn't be surprised if it were also to people in the region as well. So as for the language of barbarism among nomads, absolutely, you can find it. It exists for a long the 19th century. Others have written about this, and I think that it's there. I think that the importance here for me is how that idea of so-called barbarism gets brought in to explain the famine here. That again, it's drawing on a trope to create difference between Armenians and Kurds, to say they're over there in their civilizational stage and we're over here and there's a clear line between us, which frankly wasn't true in many areas. But that assertion and that worldview, I think, are becoming more solidified throughout this period.
And then there was a question whether or not this particular famine only affected Eastern Anatolia, or was it also a famine that happened in other places of the empire, went beyond it?
What I found in my research is it's very hard to define a single event that is a famine. It's more like a critical mass of local droughts and shortages and oftentimes poverty hitting in a certain. So when I was researching the Ottoman archives, for example, looking for correspondence on famine, there was also reports of shortage and famine in Libya and in northern Syria and in northern Iraq, which is northern Syria and Iraq are abutting the Ottoman East. Central Anatolia, I think I remember seeing reports from parts of Sivas, if you include it, but again, it's there, which is just to say it could depend on local conditions as much as on the weather. So maybe it was a drought, or maybe it was the effects of currency devaluation, but oftentimes, though, I'll say other historians who have written about these famines usually say that this one is concentrated in Eastern Anatolia. So let's go with that.
Okay, thank you so much. Other questions from the room? Yeah, Michael?
Yes.
Thank you for a great talk. I just had a curious question also about aid. So whenever I give to charity, I always like want to find websites that will tell me whether like the donation did something that I wanted it to do. Any kind of like metrics or evidence that it, succeeded. So I'm just curious, like, does the Armenian leadership in Istanbul do kind of post-mortem with the money that they collected, and like, what's their analysis like? Do they, and also if you could say, like, do other Armenian communities also kind of take an interest in whether or not the donations did what they thought they were going to do, or does it get swept up in this kind of racialized discourse of clashes of the civilizations?
This is a page from that postmortem. The report was published in 1885. So I have some impressions about Armenian aid being delivered from other archival sources from the time of the famine, but this is how they did it. So the Armenian Patriarchate was certainly engaged in this. I mean, this was available for publication, or I'm sorry, for purchase. It was published and available for purchase. If I remember, I can't remember the price, but the back of Armenian, you can find the minutes of the Armenian National Assembly or the various decrees that were issued by the Armenian Patriarchate or its different political council, religious council, education council, whatever. They had a very sophisticated governing apparatus, a constitutional governing apparatus by this point. And they made a decent amount of money too. I remember looking at the budgets once, selling these things. So they all have prices on the back in Ottoman Kurush of, in theory, you could be walking around Kumkapı in 1885 and you could buy a copy of the report yourself and pore over it, which as historians, means that we have to corroborate it with something, because knowing that it is for a public audience, what else was going on. And so in my case, it was corroborating with some correspondence of the commission, that's where the seal is from, as well as impressions of the aid being distributed by Ottoman, Armenian, or Ottoman, American, or British, or other people who were in the region and happened to be noticing this patriarchate aid getting delivered. Yes.
How much of this do you think is hyper-specific to this time and place, or how much do you think is like a framework, specifically the ecological and economic conditions, a framework to view other instances of ethnic and religious violence?
I think it does span out. I think that, and the whole reason I wanted to look at famine was to get snapshots of broader trends happening in time. The 1800s and into the early 1900s is just a period of radical transformations on many levels, both how people relate to the land, how a system of global money springs into existence and is administered by several empires. And I believe that those kinds of changes have their reverberations around the globe in different places. And so this is my way of getting a finger on the pulse of this particular region and how the kind of social collapse was reacting to those global seismic changes. But there's a great book by Mike Davis called Late Victorian Holocausts that traces famines in the 1870s from Brazil, China, Bengal, just around the world, and kind of looking at how one global ecological event could have reverberations in different ways across the globe. So, this might be one specific region, but I do believe that it is plugged into larger global changes taking place. Thank you. Yeah.
So I just also have a question of curiosity. So you're saying that a lot of these documents are coming from the Ottoman archives of Istanbul. That since post-Ottoman collapse, a lot of the archives have been purged, and this plans to fit certain historical narratives, basically governments who were purging them. do you believe any documents that might be lost or missing that would benefit your research due to like instances of like going through the Ottoman archives and getting rid of documents, or do you believe that these ones have mostly been avoided in that?
I mean, I think definitely there are things that have gone missing either intentionally or unintentionally, but there are, when a couple of years ago I got a count of this from someone working in the Ottoman archives in Ankara, there's something like 45 million digitized documents in the Ottoman archives and another 45 million that are yet to be digitized. Now, I'm sure that there are plenty of things missing, as I'm sure there are in US archives and in Armenian archives, and take your pick. So I'm sure of it, but as historians, I feel like we're always going to be faced with an incomplete archive. And that's just the name of the game. So it's a kind of piecing together things and seeing if you can triangulate. So for me in the Ottoman East, oftentimes I have to lean onto American or British accounts because they happen to be two wealthy places that have people with the resources to be hanging out in this remote corner of the world in this period, and also be sending tons and tons of letters back and forth. And so it's a good thing in that I can compare it with, an Ottoman administrator was saying this, an Armenian clergyman was saying that, and then here these missionaries are saying this, and then how can I piece something together for us today?
I have a question for you. So, I'm sort of thinking about sort of the landscape of relief efforts there. We have multiple actors that compete generally in this realm of random relief. And you showed us this image of the French publication, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how this famine was publicized in those realms. Besides, what was the narrative there? Besides the image, of course.
So, what have I seen? In American newspapers, or at least in missionary publications, you'd see a lot leaning on the environmental factor, less on the war. In Armenian publication, there's a publication called Mashak, published in Tiflis, in what is then the Russian Empire. And it's a lot about helping, at least the article I remember reading in that particular publication, it was a lot about cross-border solidarity, helping I think the language was our stomach-pinched brothers across the border, or hunger-pinched, I guess, something like that. And that's all that comes to mind, though. That's actually a very interesting question. I'd be interested to see how else it is. In missionary publications, you can find some sort of unsavory descriptions of how if you give something for a hungry belly, you might be able to find a needing soul as well. Mm-hmm. So there are these kind of tone-deaf ideas that by giving out more aid, it was trying to encourage Americans to donate. And they were sort of saying, if you donate more, we'll have more success in our process of creating Protestant converts here. And even though officially, I think a lot of people in the organization would frown on that, somehow these things would end up in publications or in letters from here and there. Sometimes I kind of raise my eyebrows at them.
There are no other questions. I would like to thank you, Matthew, for being our first in-person hybrid speaker, and welcome you once more to Michigan, and thank you for your great talk, and thank you all for coming, and our online audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ron is insisting. Do you want, if he's still around? Ron,
oh, absolutely. Wait, I thought you delivered Ronald Sweeney and Boston Davidian's questions together.
No,
have we neglected Ronald?
I I have.
We would be remiss to do such a thing.
I know. Okay, Ron, if you're still there. Okay, so Ron says a beautiful talk, Matt. So nice
Always kind
compliment.
words.
And he says you're dealing with a key question that will benefit from comparative work with other cases. In your story, ethnic religious difference escalates to conflict because of the inequality of suffering. So it is about intensification in capital letters rather than the differences themselves. But what evidence do you have of how those differences were understood? What was the content of the understanding of difference if you diminish the importance of religion?
Could you read that last part again? From what evidence do you have?
Okay, what evidence do you have of how those differences were understood? What was the content of the understanding of difference if you diminish the importance of religion? So take religion out,
Mhm.
and he's asking you to think about what the content of difference then would be.
Well, I would say the evidence I have from the time of the famine is less clear in my mind than what comes right after, which is the rise of self-defense groups that are less interested in religion and more in language, tradition, and culture, that brew that has been theorized as nationalism for the last few years. So I feel like a language of ethnicity or nation does explicitly, in some cases, express itself as separate from religion, especially among Armenians, in part less explicitly from faith than from the structures of the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul, in part because that structure is seen as cooperating with an oppressive regime and holding back the development of people. So, one thing I'm actually interested in doing further research on is the development of not the Armenian revolutionary parties, which are started by intellectuals who are in Geneva or in Tiflis or elsewhere, who are interesting in their own right and well covered, but specifically a group like the Agricultural Society in Erzurum that, in the year after this famine, 1882, they're founded, and they bring together a cross-class group of people who agree that as Armenians, they need to arm themselves and defend themselves from the predations of specifically Kurdish tribes, though others. So I think there's that on one hand. And to me, what's interesting is that is in parallel with, a few years later, the development of the Hamidiya cavalry regiments. But those are a little different because they're state funded and they draw on the charisma of already established local nobles. But I don't want to go into the weeds on that. But I would say that, yeah, an explicitly anti-establishment, anti-religious establishment set of groups that are making their voices heard, I think are one example of something different going on just after this famine.
Super. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No,
Put that
these
on
are
our
great
list.
questions.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.